Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really zeroing in on something specific. It's a single piece of data that, well, according to our source material today, should be like a giant flashing red light for the country.
Yeah, we're talking about the ACT WorkKeys test.
Exactly. And we're diving deep into this really scathing critique of the American education system. It's not just dry numbers. It's based on this, well, surprisingly sharp cultural essay.
That's the plan. We're going to unpack the arguments in this essay called 12 Years a Student and Still Can't Read a Memo.
Quite the title.
It is. And the author, Pastor John L. Widdifield, uses the failure rates on the specific test, the WorkKeys test, as his kind of exhibit A.
His proof that the whole system is fundamentally broken.
Right. His core idea, one we're really digging into, is this diagnosis he makes about a shift, away from actual objective education towards something more like, well, subjective therapy.
Okay, let's start right there with the test itself. What is this WorkKeys test that Pastor John L. Widdifield, our author for today, puts so much weight on? Because it's not the SAT, right? Not the college entrance thing.
No, not at all. It's much more basic, actually. It's designed to measure functional competence, the skills you actually need for a job.
Okay.
Pastor Widdifield points out it covers skills needed for something like 85% of jobs out there. So think practical stuff.
Like what specifically?
Well, there's applied math, not high-level calculus, but workplace math. Calculating discounts, figuring out area, basic conversions, things you'd actually do day to day.
Makes sense.
Then there's graphic literacy. So can you read a chart, a graph, understand a basic flow chart, or read a gauge, stuff you'd find in, say, a technical manual?
Right. Visual information.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the last one is workplace documents. Basically, can you read and understand things like memos, instructions, company policies, safety guidelines?
Okay, so applied math, graphic literacy, workplace documents, when you put those together.
It's really about whether an 18-year-old can handle basic entry-level tasks without someone holding their hand the entire time.
And Pastor John L. Widdifield, he doesn't mince words about this, does he? He calls it, what was it?
He says it's basically a national quiz to see if 18-year-olds can function as entry-level humans.
Wow. Okay, that's blunt.
It is. And that, for Pastor Widdifield, is the real shocker. It's not just that kids fail it. It's that the test exists at all. That's the indictment.
Explain that a bit more, the existence itself.
Well, think about it historically. For generations, right, a high school diploma meant you had basic literacy. You could read, you could do simple math. It was the baseline assumption.
So why are schools even giving this test now? Who asked for it?
That's the kicker. According to Pastor Widdifield's essay, it wasn't educators pushing for it, it was employers. They begged for it.
Businesses. Really?
Yeah. Corporate America was finding that graduates, well, they couldn't follow simple directions. They weren't ready for the workplace in the most fundamental ways.
So it's a market response to an educational failing.
Precisely. Widdifield frames it almost tragically, He says, the greatest nation the world has ever known had to invent a test to prove its own students can read instructions.
Ouch. That really puts it in perspective. The system lowered standards or maybe just stopped measuring competence, so the employers had to step in.
Like an external auditor for basic skills.
Yeah.
It's an admission, Widdifield argues, of just total system failure at the most fundamental level. And he uses that failure rate, the WorkKeys data, as the launching pad for his bigger critique about these deeper cultural shifts in education.
Right. It's the hard data point for a much broader argument he's making.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into that broader argument then. This transformation, this shift. Pastor John L. Widdifield makes this really sharp distinction early on. He says we've gone from education to therapeutic babysitting.
Yeah, it's a provocative phrase, for sure. But he means it quite literally in terms of pedagogical priorities. What is the goal of school now?
And his argument is that it used to be straightforward.
Historically, yes. He argues the main job of schools was, teaching kids to read, to write, and, importantly, to think critically about an objective reality that exists outside of them. It was about knowledge transfer, training the mind, discipline, reason.
Like mental exercise.
Exactly. But now, Pastor Widdifield claims, that's flipped. The focus isn't on teaching them to think, but rather teaching them to process their feelings about thinking.
Process their feelings about thinking. What does that actually look like in practice?
It means the student's internal state, their comfort level, their emotional response to the learning process becomes a primary focus, somewhat even over the learning itself.
Can you give an example? Because that sounds fuzzy.
Well, he talks about this concept of math identity. Think about geometry, right? Traditionally, you learn the rules, the theorems, this external logical system. You have to submit to its rigor.
Okay.
But the focus on math identity shifts that. It becomes more about, are you comfortable with your identity in the math class? Do you feel included? Do you feel anxious?
So if a student feels anxious about geometry,
The system, according to Widdifield's critique, might prioritize validating that anxiety, making the student feel comfortable, rather than pushing through the difficulty with more rigor to actually master the geometry.
which, if you take that further, could explain why basic applied math scores on something like WorkKeys might suffer.
That's the connection he draws. It's this trade-off. He has another great line. We went from diagramming sentences to diagramming emotions.
Diagramming sentences, I remember doing that. It was hard. Very rule-based, very objective.
Painstaking, right. It forces you to understand grammar, syntax, structure. It's a cognitive workout.
Whereas diagramming emotions.
Valuable in therapy? Maybe. But it's subjective. It doesn't have that same measurable functional rigor needed for, say, writing a clear workplace email or understanding a complex policy document, things tested by WorkKeys.
And Widdifield argues this leads to some weird priorities in schools.
He points out this irony you see in many schools now. He says, maybe half the seniors can't spell resume, a basic word you need for a job application. But pretty much every student has access to a counselor or resources for test anxiety.
So we're treating the symptom, the anxiety about failing, instead of the cause, which is the lack of the underlying skill.
That's exactly his point.
Yeah.
The system becomes geared towards managing the emotional fallout of failure rather than preventing the failure by ensuring competence.
It really makes you think, when does that focus on caring, on emotional well-being, actually become enabling?
That's the line Widdifield suggests has been crossed. If the system prioritizes validating the feeling around the deficiency over correcting the deficiency itself, it sort of bakes failure into the structure.
Yeah.
If test anxiety is the big problem, maybe the solution becomes making the tests easier or matter less instead of making sure students actually know the material.
And that, again, circles right back to why employers might need an external test like WorkKeys just to check for basic competence. Okay, this connects to another major point Pastor John L. Widdifield makes. He links this therapeutic shift to technology and the whole modern learning environment. He has another zinger for this: attention deficit by design.
Right. He's arguing the environment itself, the way classrooms are set up now, is actively hostile to the kind of deep, focused learning required for real skill acquisition.
How so? He mentions the physical change, right? Chalkboards to Chromebooks?
Yeah, but it's the cognitive change that follows that he thinks is so damaging. He says discipline has been replaced with dopamine.
Discipline versus dopamine. Unpack that.
Well, think about old school discipline.
Yeah.
Sitting still, focusing on one book or one problem for extended period. It requires effort, sustained attention, delayed gratification. They can be boring sometimes.
Sure.
But the Chromebook environment, often integrated with educational apps and the internet, it's built on the architecture of social media, right? Constant notifications, quick shifts, media feedback loops, little hits of dopamine.
Instant gratification.
Exactly. So the brain gets wired for that. It expects constant stimulation, quick rewards.
Yeah.
Then you ask that same brain to sit down and carefully read, say, a dense technical manual, a key skill for the WorkKeys test.
It's just not prepared for that kind of sustained, focused effort.
It's structurally unprepared, Widdifield argues. And this leads to another issue, the outsourcing of actual thinking.
Like his example about multiplication tables.
Yeah. Why memorize them when you can just ask Alexa? It's not just about saving time. He argues it's about the erosion of the mind's basic functions, memory, calculation. If you don't exercise those mental muscles on the basics, how can you build the capacity for more complex reasoning?
You dull the tool by not using it.
Right. And Pastor Widdifield uses this really vivid metaphor for how students interact with information now. He says kids flick reality away every 3 seconds like bored Roman emperors.
That's evocative.
Isn't it? It captures that sense of having the power literally at their fingertips to dismiss anything that isn't immediately engaging or validating. And if you can't stay with something for more than a few seconds.
You can't really learn anything complex or submit to the demands of objective reality.
Which brings us right back to the employers needing WorkKeys. They're not asking for rocket scientists. Widdifield says they just need people who can survive a Tuesday without a nap pod.
Meaning people who can actually focus long enough to read instructions, follow a process, do a task without constant hand-holding or needing an immediate break.
That basic ability to focus, to apply discipline, has become rare, he argues, because the system itself has undermined it in favor of this constant dopamine-driven engagement.
And this ties into his larger philosophical point, doesn't it? The idea that feelings facts equal failure.
Yes. This is the absolute core of Pastor John L. Winnifield's diagnosis. He believes the root cause of the whole crisis is the abandonment of objective truth.
What does he mean by objective truth in this context?
Traditionally, truth was seen as something external. Scientific laws, historical facts, mathematical principles, grammatical rules, they exist whether you like them or not. The goal of education was to align your mind to that reality.
To learn the facts, understand the rules.
Right. Truth was fixed, external. But Widdifield argues the new model makes truth personal, subjective, something you feel, something you declare, maybe between therapy sessions, as he puts it.
Yeah.
It's validated internally by your feelings, not externally by evidence.
And he gives that really stark example.
The creative numeracy one. It's shocking, but it makes his point powerfully. He says if a student claims 2 + 2 = 5 and cries hard enough, the system, in its drive to validate feelings and avoid discomfort, might just call it creative numeracy.
Instead of just saying, no, that's wrong, here's why.
Exactly. The emotional response is prioritized over the objective mathematical fact. The need to feel validated trumps the need to be correct and competent.
And according to Pastor Widdifield, this isn't just abstract philosophy. It has real-world economic consequences.
Huge consequences. This is where he brings in that comparison that directly relates back to work keys and functional skills. He contrasts 3 hypothetical sociology majors who maybe deeply absorbed this subjective worldview
Okay.
with the plumber with a GED.
And the punchline.
The plumber is out earning them. Why? Because, as Widdifield puts it, he still believes in objective reality.
Because plumbing requires it.
Absolutely. Pipes have to connect correctly. Water pressure follows physical laws. Measurements must be precise. There's no negotiating with physics based on how you feel about it. Gravity doesn't care about your identity.
So the WorkKeys test, measuring things like applied math and reading technical documents, is essentially testing for that ability to engage with objective, functional reality skills the plumber needs, but which Widdifield argues the broader system is devaluing.
Okay, so if the symptoms are this focus on feelings, the tech distraction, the denial of objective facts, where's the breakdown in the system itself? Pastor John L. Widdifield points fingers, right? He says it's bureaucrats, not teachers.
Yeah, he's pretty specific about that. He makes a point of not blaming the classroom teachers, the ones actually on the front lines.
So who is he blaming? The administrative layer, the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
And, if you look at the broader context he's likely drawing from, data does show a massive increase in non-teaching staff in schools over the last few decades. Administrators, specialists, coordinators, often growing much faster than student enrollment or the number of teachers.
So more managers, less focus on the actual teaching.
That's the argument. And he says this administrative bloat fundamentally changes what teachers actually do all day.
How so?
He claims teachers used to spend most of their time, teaching and grading student work, assessing actual learning. Now, he argues, a huge chunk of their time goes to filling out compliance forms.
Compliance forms, like paperwork.
Endless paperwork, seemingly. Reports for specialized programs, documentation for legal compliance like IDEA, tracking forms for social-emotional learning initiatives, detailed behavior logs, all mandated by this growing bureaucracy.
A bureaucracy that needs to justify its own existence, maybe.
That's exactly Widdifield's take. He says the system's goal becomes self-perpetuation. The education machine, as he puts it, can't teach, but never stops reporting that it's closing the gap.
So it generates endless reports about learning without actually ensuring learning happens.
It creates the appearance of activity and accountability through paperwork, regardless of the actual outcome for students. The focus shifts from product to competent graduate to process filling out the forms correctly.
And the result, according to Pastor Widdifield,
He puts it very dryly, the only thing closing is students' ability to form complete sentences. The system is designed for compliance, not competence, making it fundamentally unaccountable for actual results.
which again leads us back to WorkKeys.
Right back. It wasn't some brilliant idea from the education bureaucracy. Pastor Widdifield sees it as an act of desperation from the outside, a panic button pushed by corporate America.
Because the market needs people who can function.
Yeah, the message from employers needing the WorkKeys was basically, look, we want to hire graduates, we really do. But first, can you just prove to us they can read the safety manual? That basic functional skill tested under workplace documents.
It's a pretty stark picture of systemic failure. And then Pastor Widdifield takes it even broader, doesn't he? He connects the school failure to a larger cultural issue. What does he call it?
The Great Parental Vanishing Act. This is maybe his most provocative point, extending the critique beyond the school system into the home and society itself.
What's the core claim there?
He argues that a significant part of the problem is that many parents have, effectively, abdicated their core responsibilities. They've outsourced parenting.
Outsourced it to who?
To the state and TikTok, as he puts it. Meaning, they've delegated the moral, ethical, and intellectual formation of their children to government institutions like schools and to the pervasive influence of digital culture and social media.
And the consequence of this outsourcing?
It's predictable, Widdifield argues. Parents are then shocked, he says, when their kids graduate fluent in victimhood, but illiterate in responsibility.
Because the inputs determine the outputs.
Exactly. If the main teachers become a bureaucracy focused on feelings and algorithms designed for engagement, not wisdom, then the resulting graduate will likely reflect those inputs, may be highly aware of their own feelings and perceived slights, but lacking in skills and a sense of objective duty or responsibility.
He uses a really strong analogy to drive this home, doesn't he? Something about Caesar.
Yes, it's powerful. He says, you can't hand your child to Caesar and then complain they come home speaking Latin Marxism.
Okay, let's unpack that carefully. What's he getting at with Latin Marxism? He's using it metaphorically, right?
Yes, absolutely. We need to be clear. We're reporting on his viewpoint here. Coming from his philosophical perspective, Latin Marxism likely serves as a stand-in for any dominant state-sponsored or progressive ideology that, in his view, might prioritize things like collective identity, systemic critique, or revolutionary thinking over traditional values like individual responsibility, classical virtues, or objective truth.
So the Caesar is the ruling power or dominant cultural influence.
Right. And Latin Marxism represents whatever ideology that power structure promotes, implicitly or explicitly. His point is about delegation. If you completely hand over your child's moral and intellectual upbringing to the prevailing system, Caesar, you shouldn't be surprised when they adopt that system's worldview, whatever it may be.
You can't expect them to hold values you didn't actively instill or fight for?
Precisely. It's a call for parents to recognize their own role and accountability in shaping their children, not just relying on institutions. But it's not all doom and gloom. Despite this really quite bleak picture Pastor John L. Widdifield paints, he does offer some hope. There's a whole section titled, "But Wait, There's Hope."
Okay, good. What does he see as hopeful signs?
He suggests that the very failure he's describing is actually sparking a counter-reaction. People are pushing back.
How? What are the examples?
Well, he points to concrete trends. Things like homeschooling booming. That's parents directly taking back that responsibility he talked about.
Pulling kids out of the system entirely.
Right. And also the growth of classical schools. These are schools that deliberately focus on, objective truth, traditional disciplines, logic, history, the Socratic method. He says they're full, indicating a real demand for that kind of rigorous traditional education.
So people are actively seeking alternatives that promise the very things he says are missing from the mainstream.
Exactly. It suggests the underlying thesis is resonating, that people do want competence, rigor, and objective knowledge, and they'll go find it if the main system isn't providing it. These alternative models are basically set up to produce graduates who would likely ace the WorkKeys test because functional literacy and objective reasoning are core priorities.
Does he see any hope within the existing public system?
He does, actually. He gives a shout-out to what he calls the brave teachers. He says they're sneaking truth in like smugglers under the regime of social-emotional learning.
Sneaking truth in like smugglers, that's quite an image. What does he mean?
Well, social-emotional learning, or SEL, is that framework focused on feelings, empathy, relationships, the very thing Widdifield critiques for taking time away from core academics.
Right.
So he's suggesting these brave teachers understand that real education still needs facts, discipline, rigor. So they find ways to teach grammar rules, historical facts, logical reasoning, the objective stuff, even if they have to kind of disguise it within the required SEL lessons or do it on their own time because the bureaucracy has pushed it aside.
They're fighting a quiet battle for substance within the system.
That's the idea. And he believes they do this because, fundamentally, kids still want substance. Pastor Widdifield argues that despite all the distractions and the focus on feelings, there's a deeper human need for meaning, for structure, for reality. Kids crave it, he says, even if it comes wrapped in dusty old words like discipline and truth.
The soul needs more than just validation. It needs solid ground.
That seems to be his point. Which leads directly into his proposed solution, the section, so what now?
If the problem is this huge bureaucracy and this cultural shift, where does the solution even begin? Not Washington, he says.
No, he argues the change has to be more fundamental, more grassroots. It's got to be a revolution, but a quiet one.
Starting where?
He says the focus needs to shift. Dinner tables, not school boards.
Dinner tables, meaning?
Meaning, stop pouring all your energy into fighting a system that's maybe designed not to change, and instead, focus on rebuilding the foundations at home. That's where parents have real agency, real influence.
And he gives a very practical first step, doesn't he? Something for the listener to actually do.
Yeah, it's simple but powerful. Ask your kid what they learned today, not just, how was your day, or were you happy? Ask about the content. What fact, what concept, what skill did they actually engage with?
And then, what if the answer is not much? Or something that doesn't seem substantial?
Then Pastor John L. Widdifield's prescription is clear. If what they learned isn't true, good, or beautiful, those classical benchmarks, then teach them yourself.
Wow. That's a direct call to action. Take back the role of primary educator.
It's a declaration that the responsibility ultimately rests with the family, not the state. It can't be fully delegated.
And he frames this with some urgency, right? There's a warning if we don't do
A
this.
serious warning. He basically says, don't wait for the Department of Education to fix this, to suddenly rediscover literacy. Because if we wait, the failure just becomes more deeply embedded. He predicts that the next iteration of standardized testing, if we stay on this path, won't even measure competence anymore. It will just measure how well you feel about failure.
So the goal becomes accepting mediocrity, not achieving excellence.
That's the bleak endpoint he envisions, if the shift isn't reversed.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. Summarizing the deep dive into Pastor John L. Widdifield's critique, the core finding, really brought home by the WorkKeys test data he uses, is pretty stark, isn't it?
It really is. After 12 or 13 years of supposedly compulsory education, or enlightenment, as he ironically puts it, the system basically has to double-check if graduates can perform tasks as simple as reading an email or a basic instruction manual.
The very fact that a test like WorkKeys is deemed necessary is the loudest message. It says so much about what's been lost or sacrificed along the way.
Namely objective, functional literacy, and numeracy, the basics.
And Pastor Widdifield's overall diagnosis is that education has morphed into this, what was his phrase? A theme park of feelings.
Yeah, a theme park of feelings. And his argument is that if you prioritize comfort and subjective validation over competence and objective reality, well, the roller coaster only goes down.
Because the real world, especially the economy, still runs on objective demands, on skills, on results, not just feelings about results.
Exactly. Those two models,
Sure.
one focused on subjective comfort, the other demanding objective competence, are fundamentally mismatched.
Yeah. And that final, really biting summary line from Pastor John L. Widdifield about the cultural outcome.
Ah, yes. We've managed to make ignorance feel inclusive.
That's just, wow. It suggests that in the effort to make everyone feel okay, to lower the bar so no one feels excluded by objective standards, we might have accidentally made actual knowledge and skills seem almost optional, or even elitist.
It's a deeply provocative thought. The competence itself becomes the outlier, the thing that needs special testing like WorkKeys to even identify, instead of being the baseline expectation.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a final thought to chew on, building on Pastor Widdifield's ideas. Remember his comparison, the sociology majors versus the plumber with the GED who understands objective reality.
Yeah, the plumber winning out because his skills are grounded in the physical world.
So here's the question. If the current system, as Widdifield critiques it, is undervaluing certain objective skills in favor of subjective processing, what specific objective, maybe even difficult skill one, that requires that discipline and truth he talks about is being overlooked now, but will become incredibly valuable, maybe even indispensable in the next 10 years?
What's the next functional literacy gap we're creating? What skill, currently dismissed, will be the key differentiator that maybe the next version of a WorkKeys test will have to measure?
Something to definitely think about. We'll leave it there for this deep dive.